Ernst Franz Sedgwick Hanfstengel, or Putzi as he was better known, was Hitler's friend, confidant, and mentor during the early days of the Nazi Party. For much of the 1920s, Hanfstengel was Hitler's right-hand man. He introduced Hitler to Munich's high society and helped polish his image. He also helped to finance the publication of Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, and the NSDAP's official newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, People's Observer. Hitler was the godfather of Hanfstengel's son Egon. He composed both Brown Shirt and Hitler Youth Marches patterned after his Harvard football songs and devised the chant Sieg Heil. As the National Socialist German Workers' Party consolidated its power, several disputes arose between Hanfstengel and Germany's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, and was eventually removed from Hitler's staff. Dismayed at the way the party was heading with its anti-Semitic stance, its war footing, and the power struggles between the Nazi hierarchy, Putzi fled the country and eventually ended up sat at the table of US President Franklin, spilling all about his one-time friend and writing damning dossiers on over 400 other Nazi leaders. This is Play It Again Putzi, the astonishing story of a German-born, American businessman and socialite who stood alongside Hitler in the Nazi Party, defected, and ended up telling all Hitler's secrets to the Allies.
The line of crimson, you can't prevail. 3 cheers for Harvard and down we Yale. The line of crimson. At that moment, Hitler jumped up and said, Hanfstengel, das brauchen wir. That's what we need for a march.
Ade, mein liebes Schätzelein, ade, ade, ade. Es muss geschieden sein, ade, ade, ade.
Born in Liebigstrasse, a district in central Munich, on 2nd February 1887, Ernst Franz Sedgwick Putzi Hanfstengel was descended from German nobility. When Putzi was 2 in 1889, diphtheria brought him close to death. He was saved thanks to 3 days of round-the-clock attention from an old family servant. Throughout the illness, she repeatedly crooned, "Drink, Putzi, please drink, Putzi," encouraging him to take sips of water. The name, a Bavarian term of endearment for little fellow, stuck throughout his life, despite growing to a 6'4", towering hulk of a man with an enormous head, large jaw, and huge hands. His father was a rich Munich art publisher. His mother was from a prominent New England family whose lineage included Theodore Sedgwick, a delegate to the Continental Congress and later Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, and John Sedgwick, a revered Union general. His godfather was Duke Ernst Zee of Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha, whose brother married Queen Victoria. He had an elder sister, Erna, 2 elder brothers, Edgar and Egon, and a younger brother, Erfine. He became an accomplished classical pianist, taught by the cream of European musicians, Richard Wagner, Richard Strauss, and protégés of Franz Liszt, all of whom had been friends of his parents. As a youngster, he encountered many prominent visitors at his parents' villa, including such celebrities as Buffalo Bill Cody and author Mark Twain. Between 1905 and 1909, the young Putzi attended Harvard, the oldest and most prestigious university in America. He was immediately taken under the wing of his American relative, the famous and well-connected president of the university, Charles William Eliot. Highly popular at Harvard, Puzzi regaled his fellow students with fight songs at pep rallies for the football team, songs that would later inspire him to compose Nazi marching songs.
The line of crimson, you can't prevail. 3 cheers for Harvard and down we go.
Puzzi reveled in college life, joining the rowing crew, singing falsetto soprano in the Hasty Pudding Show, and mingling with such notables as poet T.S. Eliot and journalist Walter Lippmann. He often lunched at the Harvard Club in New York, where he met and befriended many important individuals such as President Theodore Roosevelt and his son, the future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who he fished out of the water after a canoeing accident. He also mixed at Eliot's home with men at the very top of Wall Street banking, such as J.P. Morgan and Jacob Schiff. Puzzi regularly played the Grand Steinway at White House parties and frequented the president's summer retreat at Sagamore Hill. This, together with many more famous names. Across the Atlantic, he was a friend of Winston Churchill and other members of the British ruling class. This was the dizzy, exciting social environment that Puzzi Hanfstaengl kept. After graduation, Puzzi served a year of conscription in the Royal Bavarian Foot Guards, followed by a year of study in Grenoble, Vienna, and Rome, after which he moved to New York, where he took over the management of the New York branch of his father's business, the Franz Hanfstaengl Fine Arts Publishing House on Fifth Avenue. He ran an art school in Greenwich Village and managed the family publishing house. In February 1920, Ernst married Helene Elise Adelheid Niemeyer, a Long Island blonde. She was the daughter of German-speaking immigrants from Bremen. Their son, Egon Ludwig, named after his brother, was born February 3rd, 1921. Those times working at the gallery, Puzzi says,
were a delightful combination of business and pleasure. Some of the famous names who visited me were legion: Pierpont Morgan, Toscanini, Henry Ford, Caruso, Santos Dumont, Charlie Chaplin, Paderewski, and the daughter of President Wilson.
At the outbreak of World War I, he asked the German military attaché in New York City, Franz von Papen, to smuggle him back to Germany. Slightly baffled by the proposal, the attaché refused, and Hanfstaengl remained in the US during the war. The effects of the First World War upset the grand life that he had built. 2 of his brothers were killed in the war. Puzzi's pro-German views hurt his business and attracted the suspicions of authorities. A good lawyer, Elihu Root, Theodore Roosevelt's one-time Secretary of State, helped him avoid internment. However, after 1917, the American branch of the family business, worth $500,000, was seized by the government and sold at auction for $8,000. Immediately after the armistice, Puzzi was allowed to set up a little art business, which he called the Academy Art Shop, which he kept going for the next 3 years. In July 1921, after spending the greater part of the past 10 years in America, Hanfstaengl, now age 34, gave up his wonderful life there and took his American wife and baby son Egon to Germany. You might wonder, what on earth possessed a wealthy, well-connected, now American businessman with a beautiful young wife, Helene, and baby son Egon, to move to a country riven by faction and utterly desolate thanks to the war, raging inflation, and widespread poverty? On arrival in Munich, they even found it impossible to get milk for their child. Puzzi's stated reason for going because he felt nostalgic for his native land. Hanf Stengel found a country ruined by inflation. The Weimar Republic that arose from the ashes of the war was splintered and threatened by right-wingers in the state of Bavaria who wanted to restore the country's monarchy. The German people, Putzi said, were apathetic. Germany was like a horse which ran up against a stone wall, he later wrote in his memoirs, not because it was blind, but because it just didn't give a damn. The Hanfstengels rented an apartment which belonged to the daughter of a printer at No. 1 Genstrasse in Schwabing, a district of Munich. To understand more about his beloved country, Putzi decided to study German history. During his studies, he found so many parallels about German and American social reform by articles written by American loyalist Benjamin Thompson that he decided to group his studies around him. After so much research, he decided to write a book about him. As far as history can tell, it never did get published. Adolf Hitler's background was the polar opposite of the well-bred, highly educated, sophisticated and cultured Putzis. Born in Austria, Hitler's mother was a peasant girl. His father, a minor civil servant who was allegedly often drunk and beat him. Sent to local village schools, he showed little interest in education. The teenage Adolf demonstrated an aptitude for art, but twice failed to gain a place at the art academy. For years, he was an unemployed, friendless vagabond living in men's hostels or sleeping on park benches. The unhappy, angry, and frustrated artist survived by earning a few pfennigs painting and selling postcards on the streets. Hitler was turned down by the Austrian army as too weak to handle weapons, but found a place in the German army during World War I as a dispatch runner. He suffered a shrapnel wound to the leg at the Somme in 1916 and was gassed and temporarily blinded at Ypres in October 1918. When the war ended, he decided to stay in the army for another 2 years. Awarded the Iron Cross First Class for bravery, he proudly wore the medal for the rest of his life. In 1920, Hitler ended 6 years of military service as a lowly lance corporal. Hitler rejoined the ranks of the unemployed, rented a tiny, cheap room in Munich, where he lived a shadowy existence and took to the beer halls as a political agitator. Hitler, along with his small group calling themselves the National Social German Workers' Party, was but one of the hundreds of similar rabble-rousers in the political turmoil of post-war Munich. In late November 1922, U.S. Army Captain Truman Smith, an acquaintance, approached Putzi for a favor. As military attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, Smith had come to Munich to interview Hitler and assess the Nazi Party. But the American had to return to Berlin before hearing Hitler speak at a beer hall rally. Could Putzi go and report back? Putzi agreed and joined the crowd on Rosenheimer Strasse and heard Hitler speak at the Kindelkeller. Fascinated by Adolf's fiery oratory, he became one of his most intimate followers. The chance assignment led to a major turn in Hanfstengel's life. When the pale, ill-dressed Hitler took the platform at the beer hall, Putzi was unimpressed. In his memoirs, he recalled thinking that Hitler looked like a railroad restaurant waiter or a suburban hairdresser on his day off. Then Hitler spoke, and Hanfstengel was entranced. He likened the performance to that of a master conductor. His speech, said Putzi, built up to an orgasm of words. Afterward, Hanfstengel rushed up to talk to Hitler. This man, he told himself, could restore Germany to greatness. The two met again at another Hitler speech, and soon Germany's budding leader was regularly dropping in on the Hanfstengel family, sipping coffee and doting on little Egon. Putzi and Helene even asked him to be Egon's godfather. Hanfstengel and Hitler remained extremely close through the 1920s and early 1930s. He considered Hitler a diamond in the rough, lacking refinement and social skills. He He took it upon himself to do the polishing, introducing Hitler to Munich's high society and taking him to museums in an attempt to give him some cultural gloss. He also taught him dining etiquette and formal social refinement. Putzi helped finance the publication of Mein Kampf, and dollar-rich in inflation-hit Germany, bankrolled the NSDAP's newspaper Völkischer Beobachter, enabling it to purchase more printing presses, tripling its size and increase circulation. Putzi's task was to mold Hitler into some statesman-like form to supplement the spellbinding oratorical gifts and imminent potential of Adolf Hitler and make him socially acceptable. Putzi himself relates that Hitler was open to influence and he felt encouraged to continue exerting all he could. The Nazi leader was flattered and out of his depth. At one society dinner, he was taken aback to encounter an artichoke for the first time. On another occasion, Hanfstaengl was appalled to see him piling sugar into a glass of his best Gewürztraminer wine. Convinced Hitler's violent mood swings were dictated by lack of female company, Hanfstaengl tried in vain to persuade him to take up ballroom dancing and attempted unsuccessfully to introduce him to women. Within a year, Putzi felt confident enough to suggest to Hitler that he let his little black mustache grow wider. It was ugly, he bluntly told Hitler, but if the mustache wasn't bold, Hitler was. If it's not the fashion now, he replied, it will be later, because I wear it. Being part of Hitler's inner circle, Putzi would entertain the Führertier with his jokes. He was the only performer able to do justice to the Hitler's passion for Richard Wagner by hammering passages on piano from Tristan or Die Meistersinger. He would play martial music to get Hitler into a fighting mood before he addressed rallies. When Hitler was unable to sleep, he would summon Hanfstaengl to his modest Munich flat to play more soothing melodies. Hitler dined regularly at Putzi and Helene's home and played on the floor with his godson, Egon. Much to Hitler's joy, Putzi would hammer out Wagner on the piano. He also played him football marching tunes that he picked up at Harvard.
I explained to Hitler all the business about cheerleaders and marches, counter-marches, and deliberate whipping up of hysterical enthusiasm. I told him about the thousands of spectators being made to roar Harvard, 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 rah, 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 in unison and of the hypnotic effect. I even wrote a dozen marches or so myself over the course of the years. Rah, rah, rah became Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. But that is the origin of it, and I suppose I must take my fair share of the blame.
Putzi was by Hitler's side for the next decade and more, and became, amongst other things, his foreign press chief, dealing daily with the international media. Hitler was infatuated with Helene, and after dinner would occasionally lie on the sofa with his head on her lap as she stroked his hair. She considered him sexless and impotent. Prominent Nazis dismiss Hanfstaengl's role as of no significant historical importance. He was little more than Hitler's piano player, a court jester and buffoon, ready and willing to entertain him. Hanfstaengl himself admitted that he often joked with Hitler to get him into the sort of mood when I hoped he would see reason. Putzi played musical portraits. Hitler was said to have nearly laughed himself to death when Hanfstaengl hammered out a portrait of the pompous and corrupt Göring. Or played soft runs to portray SS Commander Heinrich Himmler moving sneakily and noiselessly across the carpet. Although without Putzi, his power money, and influence, Hitler would not have been the same man that took power in Germany in 1933, if indeed he could have taken power at all. There is no question that Ernst Putzi Hanfstaengl was a major influence to the fledgling Nazi party. Putzi's wife is even credited for saving Hitler's life after things turned violent during the Beer Hall Putsch in 1923. On November 8, 1923, Hitler decided it was time to seize power. That evening, 3,000 people assembled in Munich's Bürgerbräukeller, an upscale beer hall and gathering place to hear key leaders of the Bavarian government. Hitler surrounded the hall with 600 of his stormtroopers and had a machine gun set up at the entrance to the auditorium. Leaping onto a table, he fired shots into the ceiling and shouted, "The National Revolution has broken out." Hitler then made a fiery speech intended to spark an uprising and march on Munich, just as Benito Mussolini had done to launch his victorious fascist march on Rome the previous year. But when Hitler and thousands of followers pushed down a narrow street the next morning, a force of police and soldiers blocked their way. Both sides opened fire. 16 Nazis and 3 policemen were killed. Putzi and other conspirators escaped to Austria, while Hitler fled to Hanfstaengl's country home. Hitler had also wanted to escape across the border, but his car broke down. He and his companions reached the Hanfstaengl's house after a long, difficult walk. Hitler may have suggested that destination in part because, as Putzi put it, he had developed one of his theoretical passions for Helene. Putzi believed Hitler was impotent, and that this passion never went beyond kissing her hand and sending her flowers. He had no normal sex life, Putzi wrote later. Helene agreed that her admirer was probably a neuter, but she had no doubt that he was strongly attracted to her. While Helene and Egon were having supper in the upstairs living room, a maid reported that someone was knocking softly. Helen went downstairs and, without opening the door, asked who was there. To my utter amazement, I recognized the weak but unmistakable voice of Hitler, she recalled. Helen found herself facing a very different Hitler than the one who normally showed up. There he stood, ghastly pale, hatless, his face and clothing covered with mud, the left arm hanging down from a strangely slanting shoulder. A doctor and a medic were holding him up, but they too looked pathetically rampaged. Hitler was running a temperature and was in pain from a dislocated shoulder, so the doctor and the medic eased him upstairs to a bedroom. From there, Helene heard him moaning as they tried to push his arm back into his shoulder. The next morning, Hitler sent the doctor off to Munich to see if he could arrange for another car to get him to Austria. His arm was in a sling, and he appeared to be in less pain, but he was pacing nervously about in a blue bathrobe, asking where the car might be. Helene's mother-in-law called to say that the police were already in her nearby house. Suddenly, an official cut her off and took the phone, telling Helene that he and his men would be arriving at her house next. Helene went upstairs to let Hitler know that he was about to be arrested. Standing in the hallway, he looked devastated. "Now all is lost. No use going on," he exclaimed. Then, with a quick motion, he picked up his revolver from the cabinet. But I was alert, grasped his arm, and took the weapon away from him, Helene recalled. Alarmed that he might have shot himself, she shouted, "What do you think you're doing? After all, are you going to leave all the people that you've gotten interested in your idea of saving the country and you take your life? They're looking for you to carry on." Hitler hadn't resisted when she grabbed the gun, and he sunk into a chair, burying his head in his hands. While he was still sitting like that, Helene quickly took the gun away to dispose of it, settling on a large flour bin where it easily vanished from sight as she pushed it down deep inside. Returning to Hitler, she urged him to dictate to her all his instructions for his followers before the police arrived. That way, they would know what to do while he would be in prison. He thanked me for helping him remember his duty to his men, and then dictated the orders which were to be of such importance in carrying on the work, she recalled. 2 days after the march, police found Hitler and charged him with treason. His weeks-long trial became an international event when the sympathetic judge let him rant for hours. He was given the minimum sentence of 5 years in prison. Hitler threatened to go on a hunger strike while in prison and was dissuaded only after talking with Helene. Putzi made one clandestine visit back to Germany, having grown a set of Franz Josef mutton chop whiskers as a disguise. Eventually, the treason charges against him were dropped and he returned home. Hitler credited Frau Hanfstengel with saving his life. Few people realized then that the trial and even imprisonment would serve Hitler surprisingly well. And only a few insiders knew then that it was a young American woman, the wife of one of his earliest followers, who may have prevented him from taking his own life, an act that would have delivered humanity from the devastating consequences of his political resurrection later. Hitler was released from prison in 1924 after serving less than a year. His first night out, he went to Putzi's house and asked him to play the Liebestod from Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. Hitler spent that Christmas with the Hanfstengels, playing train on his hands and knees with Egon.
Uncle Dolph!
Egon, Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas! I have a gift for you. A gift for you. Hanfstengel? Helene? You're looking lovely as always.
Years later, Egon recalled how Hitler did all the sound effects of the train, switches, whistles, starting and stopping with steam, and reenacted World War I with sound effects of various small arms, artillery, and bombs.
He was a constant visitor, enjoying the quiet, cozy home atmosphere, playing with my son at intervals, and talking over for hours his plans and hopes for the renaissance of the German Reich. It seems he enjoyed our home above all others to which he was invited.
Helene maintained that she was able to see Hitler from an absolutely different side than others would later. He was a warm person, she insisted in an interview in 1971. One thing was really quite touching. He evidently liked children, or he made a good act of it. One afternoon, as her son Egon ran to meet Hitler, he slipped and bumped his head against a chair. With a dramatic gesture, Hitler beat the chair, berating it for hurting good little Egon. Helene remembered this as a surprise and a delight, which prompted the boy to ask the visitor to go through the same act each time he came over. "Please, Uncle Dolph, spank the naughty chair," Egon would plead. Helene was fascinated by Hitler's inclination to talk and talk and talk, as she put it, and by the mesmeric quality of his voice. That fascination was in no way diminished by the main subject he focused on. The one thing he always raved against was the Jews, she admitted. Putzi and his wife Helene had a second child, a daughter named Hertha, who was born on the 20th of July 1924 and died on the 28th of July 1929, aged just 5 years. Understandable, the couple were inconsolable. Putzi partly blamed the fact that she died due to a superstition, the fact that her name didn't begin with the letter E, as all other close relatives had been named. The 1929 depression caused massive problems for most German publishers, but Putzi pushed through the idea that the firm included in its publishing catalogue a series of portraits of the Nazi leaders that turned out to be very lucrative. With his wide range of contacts and being fluent in English, he was invited to head the Foreign Press Bureau in Berlin. Much to the dismay of many Nazi hierarchy, Putzi was on the up. He was glad to go along for the ride as Hitler bullied his way toward control of Germany. He eventually officially joined the party and sometimes wore a uniform of his own design. Becoming Hitler's foreign press chief, he burnished the Nazis' image internationally, even as they destroyed books and persecuted Jews. He and Helene grew apart as he spent more of his time on party affairs. If Putzi's memoirs are to be believed, he even inspired the famous Nazi straight-arm salute, and as previously mentioned one day, he demonstrated Harvard cheers to Hitler, who cried, "Marvelous." Soon the Führer had Nazis at rallies chanting, "Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil," the way cheerleaders shouted, "Ra, Ra, Ra," at the Harvard Stadium.
Line of crimson, you can't prevail. 3 cheers for Harvard and down we Yale.
January the 27th, 1933, was a night like no other, as this was the night of the Reichstag fire. Putzi was staying at Göring's official residence in Berlin and was first to notice the fire, who quickly alerted members of the Nazi Party. They took some convincing, as they thought it was another one of Putzi's jokes, and he had to call several times until they were called to action. The supposed arsonist was Dutchman and communist Marinus van der Lubbe, who was found guilty and was executed by guillotine in January 1934. The day after the fire, Hitler's dictatorship began with the enactment of a decree for the protection of the people and the state, which dispensed with all constitutional protection of political, personal, and property rights. This was the stepping stone to what was to be called the Enabling Act, whereby all the parliament's legislative powers were transferred to the Reich Cabinet, sanctioning a dictatorship. All political enemies were either expelled, locked up, or killed. The Reichstag fire saw the end of democracy on Germany. The true story of the Reichstag fire is to this day shrouded in mystery and conspiracy, and as some high-ranking officials, including Hermann Göring, suggested that they themselves started the fire so that the war on communism would be an easy one, speeding up the process of totalitarianism. In September 1933, Putzi illustrated a cartoon-type book caricaturing many high-ranking Nazis and upsetting a few in the process. This could have been the catalyst at the start of his decline, as many top Nazis were keen to see his fall from grace. Putzi was too high-class, too well-connected, and too popular for the likes of Himmler and Goebbels, and they were not too keen on having the mickey taken out of them, as he did on many occasions. When Hanf Stengel's 25th Harvard class reunion approached, he was invited by Class Marshal Elliot Carr Cutler, class of 1909, to act as a vice marshal at the reunion. His reputation as a consummate Ivy Leaguer superseded concerns about anti-Semitism among students and faculty. Although well known at Harvard as Hitler's right-hand man, he was an international celebrity, a good musician, and that was enough for his classmates, Carr Cutler said. But not all Harvard affiliates were happy to see their institution warmly welcoming a prominent Nazi. News of Hanf Stengel's invitation spurred a flurry of protests from Jewish alumni and anti-Nazi student groups. Harvard administrators initially responded with a shrug. The decision to offer the position was made by the Independent Reunion Committee. It was out of their hands. But as criticism mounted, Hanfstaengl was pressured into resigning his marshal position. The New York Times reported on June 12, 1934, that he would remain in Germany, but 2 days later ran a banner headline on page 1, announcing his decision to attend the reunion anyway, and at the great displeasure of Hitler, who refused to let him leave Germany at such a crucial time, he went anyway. His arrival in New York was marked by angry encounters with over 1,500 anti-Nazi demonstrators. In Cambridge, anxious state troopers assigned him a security detail for the course of Reunion Week. Nevertheless, Puzzi insisted on attending several receptions at the homes of prominent alumni, including a tea party at the Conants' residence. The Harvard president later wrote in his autobiography that his response to Hanfstaengl was cold. "I did not return the greetings." Not one to surrender the spotlight, Hanfstaengl held several press conferences throughout the week, entertaining questions from the pack of journalists hounding his path around Boston. On a stroll through Harvard Yard with reporters, Hanfstaengl was asked by a rabbi about concerns over treatment of German Jews. "I will say that the Jews' situation in Germany is going to be normal before long," he responded. Tension came to a head at the commencement exercises on June 21, 1934. 2 female undergraduates chained themselves to benches in the yard and interrupted Conant's commencement speech, chanting, "Down with Hanfstaengl" and "Down with Hitler." The women were arrested for breach of peace, along with 7 other undergraduates who protested in Harvard Square, among nearly 2,000 others. Despite pleas for clemency on the part of Conant and the university, 7 students were eventually sentenced to 6 months of hard labor. For all the tumult, Hanfstaengl appeared nonplussed by the attention. "It has been the most enjoyable and successful vacation that I have had in years," he wrote several months later. On June 30th, Puzzi was in Long Island attending a wedding of his friend's daughter, Ellen Tuck French, and John Jacob Astor, who was said to be the richest bachelor in America. June the 30th. In Berlin couldn't have been any more different, as this was the night of the Long Night, where it's been estimated that up to 1,000 enemies of the Nazi state were murdered, establishing Hitler as the supreme administrator of justice of the German people. Puzzi was glad he was thousands of miles away, but worried for the safety of his family. During the next few years, others in Hitler's orbit elbowed Puzzi out of the way. They disliked his cosmopolitan air, which they thought belied the party's focus on the working class, and they saw him as a dilettante who was less than serious about the cause. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, recalled how Puzzi's personal ties with Hitler became a source of uneasiness, particularly to the ruthless propagandist Joseph Goebbels, whom Puzzi later called "that little gnome" and the pilot fish of the Hitler shark, and a satanically gifted dwarf. Goebbels, according to Speer, began casting aspersions on Hanfstaengl's character, representing him as miserly, money-grubbing, and of dubious honesty. He once brought in a phonograph record of an English song and attempted to prove that Hanfstaengl had stolen its melody for a popular march he had composed. Never a total convert to the Nazi cause, Puzzi disagreed more and more with the extreme Nazi policies and eventually lost favor with Hitler. Helene, on the other hand, became more active in the Nazi Party. Her once happy marriage dissolved in 1936 when she sued for divorce. Eventually, she too became disillusioned with Hitler and eventually returned to America. Hanfstaengl fell completely out of Hitler's favor after he was denounced by Unity Mitford. Mitford was a British socialite, known for her relationship with Adolf Hitler. She was a prominent supporter of Nazism, fascism, and anti-Semitism, and belonged to Hitler's inner circle of friends. A 1936 report proclaimed her more Nazi than the Nazis and stated that she gave the Hitler salute to the British Consul General in Munich, who immediately requested that her passport be impounded. In 1938, Hitler gave her a choice of 4 apartments in Munich. Mitford is reported to have visited one apartment to discuss her decoration and design plans, while the soon-to-be dispossessed residents, a Jewish couple, sat in the kitchen crying. Immediately prior to this, she had lived in the house of Erna Hanfstengel, sister of Putzi, who had ordered her to leave once Hitler had begun to fall out with the Hanfstengels. Punishment for such disrespect came in 1937 when Hanfstengel was dispatched on a secret mission to Spain, then in the throes of a bloody civil war. While on board the plane, he feared a plot on his life and learned more details from the pilot about the mission, who eventually admitted he had been ordered to drop Hanfstengel via parachute over Republican-held territory, which would have meant almost certain death. The pilot eventually landed on a small airfield near Leipzig after claiming an engine malfunction. This allowed opportunity for Hanfstengel to escape. He made his way to Switzerland, and after securing his son, Egon's release from Germany, he moved to Great Britain, where he was imprisoned after the outbreak of World War II. That version of the story was related by Albert Speer in his memoirs, who stated that the mission to Spain was an elaborate practical joke concocted by Hitler and Goebbels, designed to punish Hanfstengel after he had displeased the Führer by making adverse comments about the fighting spirit of the German soldiers in combat during the Spanish Civil War. Hanfstengel was issued sealed orders from that which were not to be opened until his plane was in flight. The orders detailed that he was to be dropped in Red Spanish territory to work as an agent for Francisco Franco. The plane, according to Speer, was merely circling over Germany, containing an increasingly disconcerted Hanfstengel, with false location reports being given to convey the impression that the plane was drawing ever closer to Spain. After the joke had played itself out, the pilot declared he had to make an emergency landing and landed safely at Leipzig Airport. Hanfstengel was so alarmed by the event that he defected soon afterward. He was convinced it had been a plot to kill him and refused requests from envoys, including several letters from Hermann Göring, to return home, claiming it was all just a practical joke. Putzi demanded a personal apology from Hitler, which was never forthcoming. To finance his exile, Hanfstengel began to write a book about the Nazi leader, to the alarm of those in Berlin who realized only too late the potential embarrassment his revelations could cause. However, the outbreak of war put an end to Hanfstengel's literary revenge for the time being. Described as the most dangerous enemy alien on British soil, he was interned, first in a series of holiday camps in Britain, and then, along with other leading potential fifth columnists, sent to Canada. There were 3 internment camps opened in the UK. They were the Warners Holiday Camp at Seaton and Dixon's at King's Ash in Paignton, later Pontin's Devon Coast Holidays. The third was in Clacton, later to become one of Billy Butlin's holiday parks. The parks were surrounded with barbed wire and were guarded by the local Territorial Army volunteers. The internees at Seaton have described the terrible conditions. One said, "Huts were unbearably cold, and there was a lack of food. I have never been so hungry in my life." It wasn't all bad, though. A great addition to the camp was the arrival of a complete music band from a German cruise liner scuttled in the Atlantic Ocean. In contrast, Paignton was the luxury camp where the very, very wealthy detainees paid 4 shillings and 6 pounds per day for heating and to be waited on. Many of the men who were locked up were just ordinary citizens who had lived happily in Britain with their families before the outbreak of war. Many were Italian shopkeepers or restaurant owners. Devon historian Dr. Rachel Pistol states, "At the start of the war, they only locked up a few people who they thought were the most dangerous, either because they were very pro-fascist, pro-communist, or trade unionist. As time went on, though, anyone with a connection to the Axis countries were interned." The other interesting detail that has emerged about the 2 camps Dr. Pistol suggests was that there were around 100 people at the Paignton-Dixon's camp because of the high cost for staying in relative luxury with heating and waiter service, and 650 at Warner's in Seaton. Dr. Pistol said, "The Dixon's camp at Paignton was the luxury camp. If you could afford it, you could pay to go there in order to have your own space and heating and be waited on. 4 shillings and 6 pence was an awful lot of money at the time, and you had to be very, very wealthy. Some people spent all the money they had just maintaining themselves in the camp. And then, when they ran out of money and were moved from Paignton to Seaton. Pudsey was initially imprisoned in the Seaton camp, although after selling a few expensive items on the black market, made his way to the more luxurious Paignton camp. The camps were always meant to be temporary. They were wound up by July 1940, and internees were sent to various camps around the UK, and then on to the largest camp on the Isle of Man, once it was ready. Tragically, for some internees that were transported abroad, they were being shipped to Canada and Australia. Hundreds died aboard the torpedoed SS Arandora Star, which sunk on July 2, 1940. In the sinking, 841 people died. 486 people were Italian, 175 were German internees, 52 were prisoners of war from Germany, 37 were guards, and 55 were crew members. There were 832 survivors. The authorities planned to ship Pudsey to Canada, and as luck would have it, he missed the sailing in the ill-fated and tragic SS Arandora and made his way to Quebec on the SS Duchess of York on the 20th June 1940. It was from Canada in March 1942 that a reporter encountered him in a detainment camp in Ontario and notified the White House that Hanf Stengel was eager to be useful to the Allied cause. Roosevelt was interested. He remembered Pudsey from the Harvard Club years ago. He sent John Franklin Carter, a journalist who was secretly running an intelligence unit for the president, to fetch him. Hanf Stengel went on to work for US President Franklin Roosevelt's S Project, or Secret Project, Nazi intelligence gathering, and revealed information on approximately 400 Nazi leaders. He provided 68 pages of information on Hitler alone, including personal details of Hitler's private life. Roosevelt was fascinated by the resulting 68-page study of the dictator's habits and peculiarities, calling it Hitler's Bedtime Stories. Hanf Stengel wrote what he knew and surmised about the Führer's mother fixation, his skimpy education, his physical courage, his vegetarianism, his admiration for Mussolini's speech-making, and his identification with Frederick the Great and Napoleon. He dwelt on Hitler's untenable and even desperate sexual situation, calling him impotent and an egocentric and masturbic Narcissus. His profiles of 400 Nazi leaders made for equally good reading. Himmler, he said, was immature, enveloped and insensitive, blighted by the Great War and its aftermath. Goebbels, he predicted, would abandon the cause. Carter and his colleagues also found a way to make use of Hanf Stengel in an imaginative bit of psychological warfare. Pudsey had told Carter of Hitler's fondness for Wagner. Tristan, he said, acts as a dope to him. With this in mind, Carter brought Putzi to his Washington home one night for a dinner party. After the meal and wine, he was invited to play for the group on a Steinway grand piano. Putzi opened with a few light numbers, then segued into his Wagner repertoire as if performing for Hitler. As he played, he began speaking in German, begging Hitler to end the war, to stop the destruction of their fatherland. His performance was taped for broadcast to Europe, and records of it were parachuted into Germany, rattling Berlin. Himmler issued orders for citizens to destroy the records at once, unopened. In 1943, he helped Henry Murray, the director of Harvard University's psychological clinic, Walter Charles Langer, a psychoanalyst, and other experts create a report for the Office of Strategic Services, titled Analysis of the Personality of Adolf Hitler. The portrait of Hitler that he wrote for Roosevelt was only one of a number of projects with which he was associated during his 2-year stay in the US. He analyzed German radio broadcasts and drew on his knowledge of Hitler's henchmen to make black propaganda broadcasts that were beamed home. Roosevelt later claimed Hanfstengel's insights had given him a good deal of useful enlightenment as to the mental processes of the Nazi leaders. He also found his reports highly entertaining, especially the personal details of Hitler's private life. Egon Putzi's son, who was of course an American citizen by birth, made his own return to the United States for his university education. The New York Times announced the admission of the 18-year-old to Harvard University. The newspaper also reported that he volunteered for the United States Army Air Corps in early 1941. The news about Hanfstengel's entry into the U.S. Army also received attention from Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels, who had made a corresponding entry in his diary. Egon made sergeant in the U.S. Army, serving in New Guinea. Putzi's spirits lifted when Egon was assigned temporary duty as his guard and secretary at Fort Belvoir, where Putzi was based. Egon had come to despise Hitler, his childhood playmate, and he devised a plan to assassinate him. Equipped with false documents, he could sneak into Germany from Switzerland and talk his way into Hitler's Berchtesgaden compound, carrying a message from his father. "If I can get close enough to shake his hand, I can kill him," Egon said. President Roosevelt, however, firmly vetoed the idea because he did not believe in targeting an enemy head of state. Egon returned to duty in the Pacific, but not before telling the Army Air Forces what he knew about the defenses of Berchtesgaden. After World War II, Egon became a lecturer in European and American history at Brooklyn College in New York. He then went on to be managing director of the art and publishing house Franz Hanfstengel in Munich from 1958 until its dissolution in 1980. And of course, still the godchild of Adolf Hitler, he appeared in several documentaries. He died on March 23, 2007, at the age of 86. Helene Hanfstengel, Egon's mother, and of course, Putzi's ex-wife, died in New York, August 1973, aged 80. Ernst Putzi Hanfstengel was released after the war and returned to Munich. Over the next few years, as Germany recovered from the war, Hanfstengel's art business flourished again, and he rebuilt his life. In 1957, he wrote a book of memoirs and almost faded into obscurity. In 1974, however, he made plans to go back to Harvard for the 65th reunion of his class. He had attended his 25th reunion in 1934 while still a prominent Nazi official, and his presence ignited such strong protests that police had to be called in. His arrival this time, however, made few ripples. In an interview with a Boston reporter, he described his life as an enigmatic, grim, Gilbert and Sullivan farce. The following year, he was diagnosed with thyroid cancer and died on 6th November 1975, aged 88. During a moment of depression while he was in captivity in America, he had summed up his frustration at how his life had turned out. It is a terrible thing when you think you got on a bandwagon and it turns out to be a dust cart, Ernst Franz Sedgwick, Putzi Hanfstengel, had written his own epitaph. Play It Again, Putzi, written by Darren Warren, July 2024.